Hello everyone, this is Philosophy15. I'm Robert Talisse. This is my colleague,
Scott Aikin.
The program, as you may know by now, is Scott and I talk for no more than 15 minutes unscriptedly about whatever happens to be sticking in our philosophical minds at the time. We are the authors, as you also probably know by now, of this wonderful book, Why We Argue and How We Should, A Guide to Political Disagreement. And today we wanted to talk a little bit about one of the issues that we discuss in the book that we continue to try to work on. Previous episodes of Philosophy15 have been focused largely on what we might think of as kind of sort of formal aspects of the ways in which we have developed concepts that help us to evaluate arguments at the first order. So an argument about, environmental policy is an argument about, climate change and resources and environments and biology and how animals survive and thrive and how ecosystems work. An argument about those arguments is an argument about what counts as evidence, how we deal with conflicts with respect to the data, what the role of experts is, what the relative role of non-experts might be, what values are in place, what the weight of different values are, so on and so forth. So today we wanted to pick up a little bit on this theme and talk about something that's of the same kind but has a less formalistic sort of element to it. It's been long recognized by philosophers and rhetoricians and people who work and study language that the way we describe things, or the way that we present descriptions of phenomena, can often embed normative judgments about the things being described. So here's one way to capture just that thought. When somebody who's been convicted of a crime is released from prison earlier than the sentence demanded, and we think that that person was not properly convicted, we might say the release was a liberation. When those similar circumstances or those same circumstances obtain, except in the case where we think the person was rightly convicted, or maybe the person actually did the crime even though he might not have been properly legally convicted. But when we think that it's a regrettable or a morally bad thing that the person is being released, we don't call it a liberation. We call it he was let off. When we think that some club refuses membership on immoral grounds, we call that practice exclusionary. When we think a club denies membership to people on grounds we approve of, we might call it exclusive.
Right. Selective.
Yeah, right. So it looks like there are these terms that we might say function at the first order, or explicitly present as descriptive. That practice is exclusionary. I seem to have just described it. It's like calling my coffee cup white. Seem to merely have described it. But to use the word exclusionary is at the same time as to describe it, to also morally condemn it, oppose it, cast a pall over it. And sometimes we're not always clear about this sort of this sort of double-barreled, or this sort of the two jobs that certain terms can sometimes play, like exclusive, exclusionary. Sometimes the word diversity works in this way. We don't call a heterogeneous assemblage of things that we don't mean to approve of. We don't call that an example of diversity. We just call it a mob or a mess or a hodgepodge.
Yeah.
When a collection of things is heterogeneous in a way that we think satisfies some normative good or some normatively worthy objective, that's when we use the word diverse. And so we might now say, and then we've got a set of terms that look like they serve the descriptive function, which really serve a descriptive and a prescriptive or normative function of approving. Those we can call halo terms. To characterize something as diverse or inclusive, is another one, is typically to sort of put a little halo over the thing as you describe it. Similarly, there's another class of terms that are often deployed both in this sort of double-barreled sense, they're descriptive and normative, that have the disapproving valence to them, and we call those smear terms.
Smear terms. And
can you give us, what are some smear terms?
Well, take for example in recent political debates about taxation, you have the death tax.
Right.
Right. The death tax is a perfect example of a kind of, and it's a metaphor, right? It's a metaphor that says like you're being taxed for something that just seems to befall you, right? Instead of something that you chose. And so, for example, so whenever we talk about the whether or not people can tax certain inheritances, they call it a death tax, right? And that looks like it's something that sounds objectionable, right? So this phenomenon of halo and smear terms tracks a number of other features of us being able to, you might say, do some work of evaluating in being able to just apply a particular term that sticks. And what that does is that it's a kind of non-argumentative strategy, right? It's a term that's supposed to do argumentative work, but without, you might say, premises, conclusions, being able to wrangle with anything. It's just in the naming, right? It's all in the naming. Right.
It's a way of prompting a conclusion,
right,
without having to give reasons.
And so that's going to be the crucial thing, is that it's prompting a kind of conclusion, which means that. And so let's get clear about like what we mean by prompting a conclusion, because it looks like what happens whenever you have something have a halo term around it. It looks like those who are going to reject it, right? Or if someone's their action is being charged with one of these smear terms, it looks like they now have to defend themselves. So notice, by the way, and anyone who would be criticizing something identified with a halo term, now they have to argue, right? It looks like you might say reasonable people are going to go with the halo terms. Reasonable people are going to need lots of good reasons to be okay with things that are smear terms. And that's a case of what's called burden shifting. What you've done is that you've put the burden of proof on by finding the right term that sticks. You're able to now identify who needs to do the arguing, and if their arguments don't hold together, your side is the one that becomes the default side. So identifying burden of proof means that you have to do the arguing. If your argument doesn't work, I with the halo term or you with the smear term, I'm still the one who has the default status, and it looks like I win, and you only have to argue, and all I have to do is poke holes.
All right, good. So then it might be worth disambiguating the two things that were just in what you said. So one is there are burden shifting maneuvers in argumentation,
right?
Which these are maneuvers generally designed to establish who's got the burden of proof, right?
Right.
But every burden. Is this true? Every burden shifting maneuver is also at the same time a default setting maneuver.
Right.
What do we defer to if the burden, once it's been set, isn't met? Right?
Right. Is it that we just don't know one? Right. You might say like.
So think about the legal case, right? Think about the legal case, right? The burden of proof is set up in a certain way in the legal case. Once the burden of proof in the law case is set, right? The state's got the burden of proof. That's also a way of saying, if you can't meet that burden of proof, the default
Right.
is acquittal.
Is that right? We have to. That's what we mean by presumed innocence, right? Which is, it's all on the prosecution to
Right.
be able to prove, and the defense doesn't need to prove that you're innocent.
That's right.
You just need to show
They haven't proved the guilt.
They haven't proved the guilt. If you can prove the innocence, that's awesome. But you just need to be able to prove that there's not a preponderance of evidence to be able to lock you up.
So there's so that's how argument has a similar, or can have a similar
Right.
kind of structure.
And burden of proof can be peeled apart from default status.
That's right.
But it looks like they go hand in hand. If you've got default status, certainly you're able to determine who's got the burden of proof. It's not always the case, though, that if someone's just got the burden of proof, that the other person has the default status. Sometimes the other person's just got the burden of proof, and the other person's just a skeptic, right? It's like, I don't know what to think. You need to convince me of something, and if you fail to convince me, then it doesn't mean that the contrary of what you believe is true. It just means that now we just don't know. Right. This is kind of this is the reason why people were often so frustrated with Socrates, for example. Right. Where it's like he didn't have another view that he needed. It's just that the person who said that he knew needed to be able to give the arguments. He poked the holes in the arguments, and then nothing followed.
Right. Right. So you might say that in the Socratic, or in the skeptic, not in the
Socratic /
skeptic sense.
Right. Yeah.
The default across the board is suspension of judgment.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, we can just tie this together by just saying, when you think in these terms about how the way we describe things is often part of, even if not consciously part of, but often serves the purpose of default setting and burden shifting and all the rest.
Right.
A lot of argumentative work then just gets done at the level of what is supposed to be just describing the phenomenon about which things are being, over which we're disagreeing.
That's right.
So a lot of argumentative work is done there. A lot of argumentative failure is due to people not tracking those maneuvers.
That's right. And either not challenging it, or it just being invisible to them. This, by the way, is the reason why so many of the gay marriage debates or gay rights debates always seem to be a sort of a hustle at the very beginning to figure out what metaphor or what analogy to make it analogous to, right? It's like, if you make gay marriage like miscegenation laws, then it looks like the other side wins. If you make gay marriage look like something like bestiality or polygamy or something like that, then it looks like now the person arguing for gay marriage rights has got it, right? It's like, if you can set it up so that it's got some sort of analogous valence, right, to something, it looks like once you've got that metaphor in place, now you're able to shift the burden to the other side.
And notice that this is how rhetoric works. Right. This is how rhetoricians work.
That's right.
What rhetoricians are constantly doing is engaging in what is presented as argumentation that is really just a clever deployment of halo and smear terms as a way of signaling who their audience is, so that no actual opponent ever gets confronted.
So there's another element to this, which is not just the burden shifting element, but also, as you had just said, there's a kind of audience selection that happens with halo and smear terms. In some ways, what you're doing is you're identifying what audience you want to be moved by this argument.
Right. All without ever actually engaging reasons.
Or the person you're arguing with.
Right. Well, on that happy note, thanks, folks. This is Philosophy 15, and we'll see you next time.